Hello and good evening. On behalf of the Ontario Climate Emergency Campaign and the Registered Nurses Association of Ontario, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to each of you joining us tonight. I'm Susan Bakshi, and it is my pleasure to be the moderator of tonight's Town Hall, Vote for Our Future, the Ontario Election and You. 2024 was the hottest year in recorded human history and breached the Paris Agreement target of 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures. Every fraction of a degree above this represents loss of life, human suffering, and escalating economic damage. But every fraction of a degree rise we can stop means less suffering and more time to create new ways forward for a healthier, safer, and a more prosperous planet. Tonight, we come together in our town hall to discuss election issues that matter to Ontarians now and will impact the future of our province. Over the course of the evening, we will have inspiring speakers, starting with a talk on climate impacts and the power of voting, followed by a presentation on the current party platforms and policies on some of the most important voting issues. We'll then move on to our expert panelists for a discussion on the impacts of these policies on key aspects of day-to-day life, including affordability, health, and food production and security. This will be followed by a Q&A. We will conclude our town hall with actions you can take to make the next election and next government work best for you. For Ontario, this is the time, our time, to ensure that the next election and next government works best for us, to make sure that Ontario is truly protected and our future safeguarded. But before we begin, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping matters. So the chat will remain open for the duration of the town hall. However, if you would like to pose questions to the panelists during the Q&A portion, please put those in the Q&A section. And if there is an existing question similar to yours, please vote for that rather than adding a new one. And also, if you do ask a question, it would be very appreciated if you could indicate which of the panelists you would like the question to be directed to. This Zoom meeting will be recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel. And for those that would like, the closed captioning is available. Just click Show Captions at the bottom of your screen and you'll be good to go. So I'll now pass over the mic to Joyce Hall, who will be delivering this evening's land acknowledgement. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. This town hall is being conducted from Takaranto, the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island and around the world. The territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Covenant, which binds all who live here to take only what we need, leave enough for everyone, and keep the dish clean. We acknowledge that time and again, this treaty has been violently broken. We also acknowledge that at this critical moment, we are grateful to Indigenous peoples for understanding that our human lives are dependent on the land's bounty and arise from the land's beautiful, intricate web. We hope in all humility that our efforts tonight at this town hall are in synchrony with Indigenous understanding and realize our commitment to both reconcile past wrongs and build a bountiful and healthy future, not just for humans, but for all creatures. Thank you.
Thank you, Joyce. I'd now like to introduce to you our first two speakers, Louise Como and Carolyn Holding. Dr. Louise Como is a senior advisor at ReClimate, Carleton University's Center for Climate Change Communications and Public Engagement. She is a member of the Federal Net Zero Advisory Body and has more than 30 years experience in climate change policy, communications, and solutions-related advocacy and programming. Tonight, Louise will be speaking to us on the impacts of climate change on our lives and democracy. Carolyn Holding is co-chair of the Ontario Climate Emergency Campaign, is a professional contact for Peach Health Ontario, an organization focusing on improving sustainability in healthcare facilities, and a member of Scientists for Global Responsibility. And tonight, Carolyn will present a roundup for us on the party platforms, policy, and records. Welcome, Louise.
Thank you so much. My remit tonight is to give you a bit of a simplified explanation of climate change, and I wanted to present it to you through the metaphor of a bathtub. And many of you may have already been exposed to this idea, but I thought that this would be a good simplified way to get our minds into the idea of why the reductions that we talk about in the pollution causing this problem are as deep and steep in their reductions as they are. And so if you think about the fact that we get up every day and through the lives that we live, the businesses that we run, the industry work that gets done, pretty much all of that work is fueled through the burning of fossil fuels, whether that's coal, oil, or natural gas. And we use those fuels and the burning of those fuels to run our planes, to run our factories, to heat our homes, to move our vehicles, and so on. And each of these activities, each of this burning, and I say burning over and over again for a reason, we often talk about climate change as if there's no agent. It's not fossil fuels per se, it's the burning of the fossil fuels that is causing the problem. And each year globally, we're putting into the air more than the natural ocean systems, forest systems can actually absorb. And so every single year, about half of what we generate through the burning of these fossil fuels, generating these heat trapping gases, whether it's carbon dioxide or nitrous oxide and so on, methane, stay in the atmosphere. And that means that every single year, half goes back in and another half goes in. And so this is why we talk about the concentrations of these greenhouse gases increasing in the atmosphere. And so until we get to a place where we are vastly reducing emissions, it's not a little incremental change that we need to secure here in order to protect ourselves. Just a simple kind of set of metrics. If we keep increasing emissions, the heat trapping gases do their power work and the Earth keeps getting warmer. If we flatten out emissions, warming is constant. If we decrease emissions, we slow warming. If we get to zero, we stop the warming. And if we get below zero, we can actually start to cool. And so when we talk about the need to really drastically reduce emissions, we're not being radical. We're dealing with physics. And so that's kind of the bathtub aspect of it. The second thing I wanted to share and just remind us of is that we often hear about the Paris Agreement objectives. They're not targets. We actually didn't want the world to warm 1.5 degrees. We sure as heck don't want it to warm 2 degrees, and we seriously don't want it to warm 3 degrees. But Canada is a northern country, and those are global average temperatures, and the risk to us is way higher than that. We are warming at 2 to 4 times the global average because of our northern latitude. And so you need to be thinking always about, wow, if that's the average and Canada's double that or more than that, what are the implications? Well, the reality is climate change is a threat multiplier. And the risks to our health, both physical and mental, to our financial security as a nation, as a province, as a community, and as a household are at risk. And the key aspects that I like to highlight from hotter temperatures is, in fact, the health aspects. And I know this will come up today, so I don't need to go into this too deeply. But warmer temperatures do increase the risks to the old, to the younger. And I think of my son, who is a person who works outdoors and who is actually not able to work in some of the very hot temperatures that he's now experiencing on the Ottawa climate. So think of our construction workers and our landscapers and so on. It's also that the weather is more erratic. We've supercharged the weather system in terms of energy levels. We've got more moisture in the atmosphere because it's hotter, and so we'll have drier conditions, but when it does snow or rain, it's more intense. And this unsafe weather is actually costing us a lot economically. We've exceeded $3 billion in just insured damage in 2023. And just think of the flash floods that happened in Toronto last July. That is upwards of about $1 billion of costs. So our weather is becoming more unsafe. It's making our population more unsafe. And so the question then becomes, what is it that we can do about these things? And you might, as an individual, say, well, what is it that I can do? I can't do anything. Canada can't do anything. We're a small polluter relative to the rest. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. We do know that Canada is a high per capita emitter of the pollution causing the problem. We're a large producer of fossil fuels. We need to own and take responsibility for that. But it's also the case that when we succumb, if you will, to these ideas that other countries are more responsible, the US and China and so on, we undermine our own personal and social power. But we also undermine our own understanding of the physics of climate change, because every ton actually matters. Think of a glass of water. Think of that as the global carbon budget, and think of your dripping water into that glass, and you're coming to the top of the glass, and that's where we are on the global carbon budget, that load that keeps coming every year after year after year into the atmosphere. And is it our ton? Is it a Canadian ton that takes us over the edge to 1.5 to 2 to 3 degrees? Every single ton that doesn't go into the atmosphere matters. And that idea of personal, social, collective responsibility is one that I hope we can really get across in this conversation. No matter who we are, we have a really, really, really important role to play. I want to raise just a couple of pieces of the challenges that we face. It's surprising to many, but Canadians still think of climate change as a distant and future problem. Even with climate impacts happening every day, it's still affecting a small number of people. Even through media exposure, people tend to perceive climate change as a threat for other people in the future and in other places. We need to tell better stories about the effects of climate change in our communities. We also, through misinformation around the carbon price, have really created the perception that climate action is unfair. We've got to establish that actually dealing with climate change is fair. And the biggest way to do that from the public perspective and the research I do is to hold big polluters accountable. And so let me just close by saying, I think this is why Susan's here to guide me to close off my chat, is that we do need to make climate action an issue that influences our vote. It happens to be that most folks do not vote with climate change in mind. I'm sorry to say that, but it is true. We need to talk about climate change to everybody we know, and caring and loving ways. We need to be a role model in every way that we can, particularly about telling people that we vote with climate change in mind. We need to demand that polluters be held accountable. And I say this because you are in an Ontario election. We're about to come to a federal election. And I would say in many ways, after 34 years of working on this issue, that our failure to deal with climate change has been a failure of democracy. And so we do need to vote with this issue in mind, and to bring attention to politicians that this is an issue that we care about and that we intend to vote on. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I feel like the most unpopular person in the room cutting you off, because I think we could listen to you all night. But we're going to head over to Carolyn now to hear about all the policies and programs that are top of mind. So take it away, Carolyn. Carolyn, you're muted still.
Okay. So good evening. My name is Carolyn Holding, and I'm a co-chair with OCEC. I'm going to provide an overview of party platforms, policy, and performance on key issues. We have used a variety of sources to get this overview, including party platforms where they're available, party responses to specific questions they've been sent, media sources, including the CBC, and expert independent professional reports. We've attempted to apply criteria objectively, but there is always some judgment to be made. Sometimes information was also difficult to find. Nonetheless, we've done our best to collate it, and we're going to go over the key issues now. Okay, first of all, affordability and energy. So it's just a bit of a, it seemed easier to put the issues in a table to make it more comprehensible. So first, we're going to consider affordability and energy. In terms of the first column, related to accountability, the Conservatives got across here because they ignored advice from Ontario's independent regulator in energy policy and have taken steps to lessen its independence from government. They commissioned their own report about how to decarbonise our energy sector, but wouldn't release it. The Greens get a check mark here because they've stated their commitment to reinstating the OEB's independence. And the NDP gets a check mark because of their stated commitment to using independent advice to guide policy regarding nuclear energy. All parties except the PCs have committed to phasing out polluting so-called natural gas, an energy source that is ultimately more costly compared with renewables and improved efficiency. All parties have programs related to improved efficiency, one of the cheapest ways to improve energy affordability. The commitment to nuclear is mixed. The Greens are committed to no expanded nuclear. The NDP would wait for independent advice, and the Conservatives and Liberals have said they will increase or they will utilise it. And finally, distributed energy, which is a different kind of way to distribute energy, and some reports have said it's cheaper. The NDP said in a 2024 bill that they tabled that they proposed that, and the Greens have voiced support for it. The next issue is affordability in housing. So the Alliance for a Livable Ontario commissioned a report to understand how to address the housing crisis. The table is organised around some of the recommendations within that report. In terms of pathways to home ownership, all parties have stated strategies to make this more attainable. In terms of policies that encourage a variety of different homes, for example, for singles, families, multi-generational families, with medium density and mid-rise housing, all parties had policies to support this. In terms of building near public transit, all parties had policies or promises that supported this in some form. Conservatives get a cross and a check mark due to their focus on encouraging urban sprawl, which would rely on just highways and cars that would be far away from public transport. And they're kind of the signalling to developers the emphasis on large family homes in sprawling suburbs. And finally, the commitment to no sprawl or to having firm boundaries. Again, the Conservatives have come up short in terms of not committing to that. Affordable rent the building of affordable non-market housing is the next issue. There's been a big commitment of the NDPs to there's a real need for non-market affordable housing, and most parties have committed to that in some form. The Conservatives have a mixed record there. They have committed to some tax breaks for not-for-profit, but they haven't met affordable housing targets. In terms of affordable rents have soared. All parties except the Conservatives get a check mark for commitments to make a rent more affordable. Conservatives get a cross. They scrapped rent control, did not renew subsidies for individuals living on ODSP, and increased the amount by which landlords can increase rent. ODSP and OW have not kept up with inflation. Okay, the next is health. Highlights of the health sector as follows. All parties have promised to put within 4 years for all Ontarians to have primary health care. The Conservatives get a mixed result there because of a reduction, in fact, during their term of people's access to primary care. In terms of the first column, the not-for-profit, most of the parties have stated their commitment against for-profit healthcare. The Conservatives said they wouldn't, and then pretty soon after they were elected, they started to institute it. After denying plans to do that. In terms of funding and workforce and pay, the budget has increased for public health but hasn't kept up with inflation. The for-profit staffing industry has grown enormously, which has knock-on impacts for public because there's no more professionals to fill the places of people who transfer to for-profit. The Conservatives chronically underspent the health budget. In terms of wages, workforce, working conditions, all parties got a check mark due to their commitment to fair pay, working conditions. All parties, of course, except the Conservatives, I should say, their stated commitment to increasing the workforce through medical school and 2 new medical schools, the Liberals said, increased residency spot, international hires. Liberals committed to a living wage for PSWs and nurses. NDP to wage parity across health sectors and safe patient-nurse ratios. And the Greens emphasised the importance of preventive health. The Conservatives got across due to a number of factors, including a wage cap. It was appealed. The Supreme Court struck this down, and the Conservatives appealed this decision, but it was upheld. They committed not to ending hallway healthcare as promised, but that didn't eventuate. And as I mentioned, human resources are diverted to the for-profit sector. Agriculture and food. So first consideration within the agriculture and food sector is protecting the green belt. So the NDP, Liberals and Greens all have strongly committed to doing so. The Conservatives took 7,400 acres from the Greenbelt. They added back 9,400s, but there was less conservation value in what they added back, and it was already protected from development in other ways. There's also been issues with taking land from farming for other uses like industrial or development, such as in the Wilmot community, or Highway 413, the Bradford Bypass, and of course the Greenbelt. All parties have voiced commitments to doing something about the tariffs, including encouraging purchasing food locally, and having policies regarding procurement with that, like the public sector needs to procure a certain proportion from local farming. They mentioned supply chains, infrastructure. Those parties have all put out information on that. In terms of grocery affordability, the NDP specifically mentioned a policy regarding subsidies for related to helping low-income families afford groceries. And 3 of the 4 that I found, I'm not sure about the Liberals, but mentioned anti-price gouging policies or watchdogs. In terms of accountability, the NDP, Liberals and Greens get a check mark. They have called for investigations regarding the land deals that occurred with the Greenbelt. And the Conservatives, of course, were involved in that. And lastly, the Liberals and Greens both mentioned innovations in research and sustainable farming. Finally, climate, which has a cascading effect on affordability in all sectors, including health, farming, and energy. As you can see, most parties have made promises or demonstrated commitment to the issues related to climate, having a climate or an environmental action plan, investing in public transit, having emissions reduction goals and proposed policies to back that up, commitment to a cap and dividend system, protection for water, air, and natural systems, and protecting the Great Lakes. So the Conservatives do have an environmental plan. They got rid of a climate action plan and did put in an environmental action plan. They did, in terms of public transit, there were cuts, but now they've pledged to provide more money, and extra money was afforded during the pandemic. Emissions reduction, emissions have actually gone up and also with proposed changes to the energy sector, that's going to get worse. I couldn't. There was no information that we found regarding what they thought about cap and dividend. And in terms of protecting water and natural systems, there was some commitment, for instance, for rivers, but not for the Great Lakes. And they have passed laws that undermine the strength of the conservation authorities, which is concerning because part of the role of the conservation authorities is to manage things like wetlands and those sorts of things influence flooding in urban areas. That's where they came from in the first place. Okay, so that wraps up my summary. And I'm going to throw it back to Susan, who didn't even pop up on my screen.
Well, I actually did. You just can't see me, but I've only been here a second, so thank you so much for keeping to your time, and thank you for all of that. That was fascinating. So thank you, Louise and Carolyn, and I'm going to now introduce you to our 4 panelists. First up, we have Catherine Bakos, the Managing Director of Climate Finance and Resilience at Intact. Catherine's work has had national and international influence, including informing all levels of government on how to adapt more effectively to changing climates, including the impact of flooding on the housing and mortgage sectors. And Catherine will be speaking via a pre-recorded video on affordability and the impacts of climate change. Catherine will be followed by Mark Winfield, Professor of Environmental and Urban Change at York University. Mark is also co-chair of the faculty's Sustainable Energy Initiative. He has published articles, books, chapters, and reports on a wide range of climate change, environment and energy, law, and policy topics. Mark will be speaking tonight on energy policy and its impacts on climate change and affordability. Following Mark, we have Dr. Millie Roy, a practicing physician and surgeon. She is assistant professor with the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Toronto and co-chair both for the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment Ontario chapter and the Ontario Climate Emergency Campaign. Millie will be speaking on the impacts of climate on health and healthcare systems. And our final panelist tonight before the Q&A session will be Brent Preston. Brent owns and operates the New Farm, an organic vegetable operation, and is the co-founder and president of Farmers for Climate Solutions, a pan-Canadian coalition of farm organizations that advocates for better climate policy in agriculture. He is the author of The New Farm, our 10 years on the front lines of the good food revolution, a national bestseller. And tonight, Brent will be speaking on agriculture, land use, and food security. And I'll pass it over to Tim to start the video. Thank you.
Is the slide Center, and I am Managing Director of Finance and Resilience at the Intact Center on Climate Adaptation at the University of Waterloo. For those of you unfamiliar with the Intact Center, we're an applied research center out of the University of Waterloo that helps homeowners, communities, businesses, and governments reduce risks associated with climate change and extreme weather events. That's particularly in relation to flooding, wildfire, and extreme heat, as you can see from the photos here. So climate change manifests itself as extreme weather, and these events are becoming more severe. Last year alone in Canada, we saw devastating flooding in Montreal and Toronto, the largest hailstorm ever in Canadian history in Calgary, and of course, the Jasper wildfire. These events cause power outages, supply chain impacts, evacuations, socioeconomic implications, and sadly, loss of life. And so over the next 8 minutes or so, I'm going to discuss the evolving nature of climate change, its financial impacts, and what Ontarians can do to reduce their risk. Next slide, please. So we know from authoritative bodies such as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and Environment and Climate Change Canada that a certain degree of climate change, it is in fact irreversible. While we can slow down the rate of change, we cannot reverse it, at least not with the technology that we currently have. Now, there are natural fluctuations and variations within the Earth's atmosphere, but we know that the leading cause of this change is the burning of fossil fuels. So strategies to mitigate against greenhouse gas emissions, and they must continue. We must continue to put resources, time, and money towards those initiatives. But we have to recognize that mitigating a greenhouse gas emissions, that's going to avoid the worst impacts of climate change in the future. But sadly, it will not stop or reverse the damage that has already been done. And therefore, adaptation, building resilience at the level of our homes, communities, and across our businesses must also be an important part of the climate change discussion. And yet globally, we know that adaptation financing, planning, and implementation are all plateauing. We are not putting enough resources towards adaptation. And yet we also know that for every dollar that we put into place for adaptation will save us on average $2 to $10 in cost avoidance over a 10-year period. So climate adaptation is the cost-effective strategy when year over year, the costs associated with climate change continue to increase. So the question is, well, what are the costs of climate change and extreme weather? Next slide, please. So this image here displays the annual catastrophic insurable loss claims for Canada. A CAT loss is any event, flood, wildfire, hailstorm, windstorm, that triggers $30 million or more of insured losses. So this graph here begins in 1983 and goes up to last year, 2024. Losses now average approximately $2.8 billion a year, with 2024 reaching $8.5 billion, ranking it the worst loss year in insurance history for extreme weather in Canadian history. Now, these are insurable losses. Last year in 2024, uninsurable losses reached approximately $24 billion. And that's money coming out of the pockets of individuals, businesses, and governments. And the trend of this graph, it's also that upward trend. When you map for Ontario specifically and losses in Ontario, the trend of the graph is still the same for Ontario. It's trending upward. Now, these figures, they are adjusted for inflation and per capita wealth accumulation. So this is providing a true apples to apples comparison year over year. Now, climate change, it contributes to the rising losses and other factors, climate change contributes to these rising losses, but there are other factors at play here. So we have aging municipal infrastructure that never incorporated adaptation into decision-making, and the loss of things like natural infrastructure, wetlands, grasslands, and forested areas. Now, this graph here, it's not just to talk about insurance, the financial impacts to insurance. Insurance is just a very good proxy for the growing risk in the system. But if insurance is being hit, most, if not all, other industry sectors are to some degree. Now, in regards to insurance, though, we know from the Insurance Bureau of Canada that 10% of the Canadian housing market, approximately 1.5 million homes, are now currently uninsurable for flood risk. Now that uninsurability, it translates to Ontario as well. So 10% of Ontario's housing market is uninsurable for flood risk. And flooding is the costliest extreme weather that is impacting Ontarians. So that flooding, it's mostly translating as flooding manifesting itself as flooded basements. Now that's from an insurable perspective. Uninsurable would be impacts to bridges, roads, and buildings. Now, to give a little bit of context, the average cost of a flooded basement in Ontario is $54,000. Now, most insurance companies will put a cap on that limit, and that coverage is usually around $10,000 to $20,000. So a homeowner could be on the line for $44,000 anytime their basement floods out. And we know that 50% of Canadians are living paycheck to paycheck, so people might not have that liquid cash in hand. So putting measures in place to reduce that risk is incredibly important. Now, just for a little bit more context, in Quebec last year, Desjardins Financial notified clients that it will no longer be offering mortgages in certain regions, meaning that you cannot buy or sell that house because if you can't get a mortgage, most people won't be able to pay outright, and the risk is just too great in that system. So those homes are at risk of becoming stranded assets because of their flood risk. And so if that can happen in Quebec, that could very easily happen in Ontario as well. So now we're seeing these cascading and eroding effects throughout our economy. And it's not just the uninsurability, but the stability of Canada's housing market. Next slide, please. So this is where the Intact Centre report, Treading Water: Impact of Catastrophic Flooding on Canada's Housing Market, really comes into play. So this was the first ever quantitative analysis in Canada looking at the impact flooding has on the Canadian housing market. So this report, it investigated whether flooding impacted the average sold price of a house, the number of homes on the market, the number of days on the market, and mortgage arrears and deferrals. So the slide highlights the results quite well, but in short, homes located in flooded communities. Now listen to my wording there. Homes located in flooded communities. The home did not need to be flooded out. It only needed to be stigmatized by the community that was flooded out. So homes located in flooded communities saw an 8.2% reduction in the sold price of their houses. 44.3 less homes were listed on the market in flooded communities. And when homes were listed on the market, they stayed there approximately 20% longer. Now, when investigating the impact flooding had on mortgages, there was an impact to what's called loan to value ratio, which impacts mortgage providers and insurers. Now, to clarify, all of these results that you see here, those are representative for Ontario as well. So when you break them out, we looked at, I believe it was 4 different communities across Ontario, and they all had fairly similar results to the ones you see here. So to minimize the risk against a backdrop of escalating extreme weather risk, all levels of government, mortgage providers, insurers, utilities providers, and other important stakeholders within communities need to understand how climate change is evolving and, if possible, deploy information to homeowners and renters to reduce these risks. Next slide, please. So I know I've given you a lot of bad news, but there's actually really good news in Canada and here in Ontario, specifically because guidance and tools are already available to reduce those key physical climate risks across Canada and here in Ontario: flooding, wildfire, and extreme heat. So our team at the Intact Centre, we've worked with subject matter experts across Canada to develop practical, meaningful, and cost-effective ways to adapt to the physical risks of climate change. So I know this slide is quite busy. There's a lot of resources here. We are quite limited on time, so please check out our website. All of our resources are freely available. If you need information on how to reduce extreme heat, please go check it out. If you live in a northern community in Ontario that's impacted by wildfire, please check out our wildfire resources. So just as a very quick review, on this slide, I've provided guidelines and tools to reduce the risk of flooding at the level of the home, various levels of communities, commercial real estate, and the importance of retaining and restoring natural infrastructure, wetlands, grasslands, and forested areas. In regards to wildfire, the Intact Centre has worked with Fire Smart Canada to develop wildfire protection measures at the level of the home and community. And the Intact Centre has investigated the impact of extreme heat on infrastructure and services, the economy, natural systems, and community health. And we've developed ways to reduce risk at the level of the home and apartment and condo. Now, for all of Ontario, flood and extreme heat would be the greatest risk, specifically in urban areas, while wildfire would be a severe risk in northern parts of Ontario. Next slide, please. Now, we are quite limited on time, so I just want to show a close-up of one of those images on the previous slide. And what we did was we took the findings of one of the reports also on that previous slide. And what we recognize is people don't want to read 100-page or 50-page reports. So what we did was we took the findings of, on the previous slide, the flood and home report, and we distilled that information down into this one-page, 3 steps to cost-effective home flood protection infographic, which drills down on characteristics around and inside a home that, when high precipitation events occur, could impact the probability that a home is flooded. So this infographic provides 15 key actions in 3 easy steps. And what you'll notice is those 3 easy steps are denoted by price. What can I do for $0, under $250, and over $250? So these actions include cleaning out eaves troughs, putting window well coverings over window wells, installing extending downspouts, and installing sump pumps and backwater valves, and then checking your sump pumps and cleaning out your backwater valves. Now in Ontario, we're currently living through a housing crisis, and it's build, build, build. Well, in my opinion, any new home development should include sump pumps and backwater valves. That should just be part of any new home construction. Now, we know when we provide homeowners with this infographic, 70% of homeowners that report receiving the infographic operationalize at least 2 measures within 6 months. So we know that when you actually get this information into people's hands, people actually act.
Thank you to Catherine. That was an excellent presentation there. I'll now pass it on to Mark Wingfield. And Mark, you're muted.
There we go. And from the beginning. Yeah.
We're good. We can hear you now.
Yep. We're just waiting for the deck to catch up. Here we go. Great. Thank you. Thanks very much for the opportunity to talk about this. So I'm going to focus on the electricity and wider energy dimensions of climate in Ontario, but mostly focusing on where the electricity system is going. The system in Ontario is kind of an interesting case study in the sense it's a convergence point of a whole range of different debates around centralized versus decentralized pathways, what the future roles of nuclear, gas, distributed resources, demand-side measurements, and measures in energy efficiency. Just a bit of background in terms of how the system has evolved. Up until 1960, Ontario's electricity system was in fact 100% renewable, and entirely hydroelectric, gravity-fed. We did begin building coal plants in the 1960s, and then went through a massive expansion of the role of nuclear power between the 60s and the 90s. We then, in the late 90s, had a significant portion of the nuclear fleet go on the blink, which then led to a large expansion of the role of coal-fired generation, which set in motion a chain of events that ultimately led to the phase out of coal-fired generation, which had constituted 25% of the system. This is generally regarded as the single most significant action taken by any North American government so far to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. As part of that process, we did begin to introduce significant non-hydro renewables, principally through the Green Energy Act. We added about 8,000 megawatts of wind and solar, but we did also add about 5,500 megawatts of gas-fired generation, and I'll come back to that later on in the system. The Ford era is defined by a number of things, most notably and famously the cancellation of 758 renewable energy projects, including, and so far as we can tell, a unique event of actually having completed wind turbines ripped out of the ground at the White Pines project in Prince Edward County. The Green Energy Act was repealed, although in fact renewables procurement had already stopped under the wind government. The relatively successful energy conservation strategy was terminated. the entire climate change action plan, which had been adopted by the previous government, was terminated as well. The pathway now being taken by the Ford government largely laid out in the Powering Ontario's Growth document, and it has a very, very strong emphasis on nuclear and what sometimes called natural gas or fossil gas. What we are now pursuing is a fairly massive nuclear expansion program. There is the ongoing refurbishment of 4 units at Darlington, but also a proposal for 4 300 megawatt, what are classified as small modular reactors. There's an ongoing refurbishment at Bruce, and now proposal for 4,800 megawatts of new capacity there. Rough estimate could be in the $100 billion range there. The possibility, Pickering A has now closed. There were 4 reactors there, but the possibility of refurbishment at Pickering B, another 4 reactors, has been reopened. Probably 15 billion there. And then last week, the premier announced that they want to build a 10,000 megawatt nuclear project at Wellesleyville, which is somewhere between Cobourg and Kingston on the north shore of Lake Ontario. If you were to take the actual cost of the Vogtle nuclear plant in Georgia, which is the last nuclear plant completed in North America in several decades, that would translate into a capital cost in the range of $200 billion. So the total commitment on nuclear at the moment is in the range, and this is at this stage trying to keep up a sort of chalkboard level estimate, $400 billion. Just keep in mind the idea of burying the 401 only is clocking in at around 100 billion. This is in sort of project cost to GDP ratio about the same as the Muskrat Falls project in Newfoundland relative to the provincial economy. And we know that has ended badly for Newfoundland in multiple ways. Along with this, there is clearly any growth on renewables has been terminated. There is both a growth in the role of the existing gas plants, which were only running on a very occasional basis and now are basically running flat out, and additional gas capacity is being added. The expectation is that if the plans that are currently in place continue, gas will constitute the same portion of the Ontario system as coal did prior to the phase out. And we are looking at essentially an 8-fold increase in greenhouse gas emissions from the sector relative to the low in 2017. As I mentioned, no movement on renewables until very, very recently. It's not clear what's going to happen there. A little bit of re-engagement lately on conservation, demand management, demand side stuff. There's been some discussion I saw in the chat about distributed energy resources, which we can explain a little more in the Q&A, but very, very limited actual deployment, even though there's been quite rigorous analysis that suggests, well, we don't actually need to expand the role of gas if we can do distributed resources, which means rooftop solar, networked ideally with the fleets of parked electric vehicles or facilities level energy storage assets. We can talk about that later. So basically what's going on is an embedding of increasing costs and increasing emissions from the sector. It's sort of the sort of worst possible scenario on all fronts. Total nuclear program costs, say, I would estimate in the range of 400 billion. And keeping in mind that we are already subsidizing electricity rates out of general revenues to the tune of $7.3 billion a year. That is money that would otherwise be going on schools and hospitals, which is being used to artificially lower electricity rates. The projections, of course, continue upward. What we're seeing now does not include any new build on the nuclear side. This is just principally driven by the refurbishments of the existing fleet. There has been a great deal and probably more modeling in Ontario than anywhere else about what pathways to decarbonization that don't involve gas and don't involve nuclear expansion look like. These have all been pointedly ignored by the government. And it seems very much on this pathway where it's heading. The big winners, unsurprisingly, look like the institutionally embedded incumbents, Ontario Power Generation and Bruce Power. There's a limited federal role here, but even the federal clean electricity regulations actually are designed very carefully to provide a loophole to accommodate Ontario's gas expansion plans, which does mean that the total, the sort of net zero target for the electricity sector nationally has been pushed back beyond 2050. The original plan was for 2035. Short on time, but just sort of comparing, where are we at? Well, we're on a high cost, high risk, high impact pathway in which all the other options are essentially marginalized. Conservation, demand side, distributed resources, renewables, thank you, interties and everything else. If you were doing this in a sustainability context, you would probably aim for the lowest risk, lowest cost, and lowest impact options first, conservation first, distributed resources, renewables and storage, strengthen interties, avoiding gas expansion. We are probably stuck with the Darlington and Bruce refurbishments, but probably don't need to go beyond that. And certainly any new nuclear would need to be subject to a very high level of scrutiny and absolutely an option of last resort. So I'll leave it there. We've not seen a lot so far from the various parties. There's a bit from the Greens just yesterday, but that's about where we are. So I'll leave it there, and I'm sure we'll have questions further on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. I'm going to now call up Millie Roy for her presentation, please.
Thank you. And I'm just going to get my get this working here. Okay, sorry there. Okay, thank you to everybody for being here for this conversation, and we'll just jump right in. Health, of course, has always been a top priority for Ontarians, but sadly, our healthcare has never been in such a state of crisis. Beyond health policy, Ontarians' health is deeply impacted by other policies, especially anything failing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and control the climate crisis. So this is our chance to vote for better by understanding those connections. And please post your questions in the Q&A as we go through. Now, to begin with, Ontario has the lowest public health funding per person anywhere in the country. And yet our budget increases are not even keeping up with inflation, not even close. Furthermore, the healthcare budget is not being spent in full. And finally, the public money we do have is partially flowing into privatizing public hospital services. And all of this is undermining our healthcare. Despite a healthcare worker crisis, this current government passed a bill in 2019 capping wage increases for public health and other public sector workers. It was struck down as unconstitutional by the courts, despite the government appealing. This cap was imposed on public sector health workers only, while for-profits were not capped. Let's look at privatization. A record number of healthcare privatization lobbyists have been registered under this government. Operating funding for public hospitals, for example, increased only 0.5 percentage point last year. By comparison, one of the only two for-profit Ontario hospitals received a funding increase of 278%. And the lobbyist acting on their behalf was none other than the former Minister of Health from this government after exiting the ministry. Furthermore, this government has not curbed the practice of for-profit staffing agencies that are charging up to triple the price for exactly the same staffing and service employed in the public system with our tax dollars. So the bottom line on health privatization, with the very best evidence and studies that we have at this time, Privatization reduces the quality of healthcare and worsens health outcomes. And that is something to really consider when we are deciding how to vote. So let's look at where we are with health outcomes after 7 years of the current government administration. Ontario had the lowest number of hospital beds per capita in Canada in 2022. We're projecting a shortfall of nearly 14,000 hospital beds and over 80,000 staff by 2032. Despite a campaign promise to end hallway healthcare, the numbers doubled between 2018 and 2024. And despite the vast majority of our hospitals, these are now running in deficit almost exclusively, which is very concerning. And we have seen unprecedented closures of vital services. Over 1,200 times we saw closures of ERs, ICUs, and labs in 2023, which is not acceptable. And the number of Ontarians without a family doctor has skyrocketed from 1.8 million in 2020 to 2.5 million now, and a staggering 4.4 million projected by next year. Now, let's move from health policy to, I'm not sure what happened here. From health policy to the impacts of climate and climate policy on our health, with the understanding that climate change harms our healthcare systems as well as our health. Take a look at this, this massive pharmaceutical plant that has been damaged in a tornado. Events like this can have ripple effects with shortages of drugs and medical supplies for over a year and are getting more common. Have a look at the upper panel with this fireball, a wildfire threatening the Yellowknife Hospital, which had to be evacuated in a military operation with a patient dying during the evacuation. And in the center of it all, our healthcare personnel becoming overly stressed and burnt out. Looking now at the harms to our health itself, every time we burn fossil fuels, we're producing health by two pathways: the carbon pollution pathway that leads to climate change, and the air pollution pathway that releases toxic particles and gases which harm our health. If we look at the carbon pollution first, hands down, we now understand that climate change is the single greatest threat to our health of the 21st century, and that our very survival is at stake. This blue map from the Canadian Medical Association shows impacts right across the country. This ranges from extreme heat, which killed over 600 people in the BC heat dome. Forest fires, we've lost Jasper. We've seen Los Angeles devastated. This is all over the world. And harm to housing and food security, which are social determinants of health. We know that about 60% of infectious diseases are going to be worsened by climate change, which is simultaneously increasing antibiotic resistance. So the medical community is very, very concerned. And now let's look at the health harms of that air pollution pathway. Around the world, over 8 million people are dying every year now due to air pollution, which translates to over 15,000 Canadians and nearly 7,000 Ontarians every single year. And this happens because when we breathe in this polluted air, it, of course, enters to our lungs and causes severe lung diseases, but then it passes into our bloodstream where it can cause serious heart diseases, brain diseases, multiple forms of cancer, risks to pregnant women such as birth defects and to babies. And both pathways, climate change and air pollution, lead to devastating mental health harms that especially affect our youth, and even to the point of causing depression and suicide. And we have high levels of evidence for this. Let's move now to look at the impacts of energy policy on our health, and it is critical. We just heard from Dr. Winfield. Fossil fuel-based energy policies such as gas are expensive, but also harmful to human health, as I just mentioned. Nuclear energy, very expensive, as we just heard, exorbitant cost, too slow to meet our urgent energy needs, but also Canada to date has no permanent solution for the decades of accumulated radioactive nuclear waste. Experts are deeply concerned with the health risks of proposals like the Chalk River repository and northern deep geological repositories. And there's a lot more we can talk about if you pop your questions in the Q&A here. Let's look at housing, which is fundamental to health. Under the current government, homelessness has risen to record highs. The Auditor General has clearly identified that this ministry does not have a good strategy for the reduction of homelessness. This is increasing the risk of communicable diseases. TB is on the rise in Toronto, and there's increased usage of fire, paramedic, and emergency room services. So not only is the unhoused person suffering, this affects all of us. Sorry about that. Under the current government, new housing starts are at a 69-year low. And the More Homes Built Faster Act floated by this government not only tried to build over the Greenbelt, but it also contained legislation that undermined affordable housing and renters' rights in many ways that actually were not reversed. We know that supportive housing costs only $500 a month. Compare that with $12,000 for a hospital bed or $9,000 for prison. If we could permanently house 3,000 emergency shelter users in Toronto, we would save $60 million a year. So housing people, it is healthier, cheaper, and safer. And finally, let's look at food as well, being fundamental to health. Food bank use as well under this government has risen to record highs due to cost of living, poor employment opportunities, and failing government support programs. And poor climate policy, which drives the climate crisis, combined with current land use policies, which are destroying over 300 acres of farmland every single day, disrupts Ontario farmers' abilities to grow food. And we're going to hear from Brent right afterwards all about that. This increases food insecurity, which harms our health directly. It damages our food independence if we want to grow local, eat local with the threat of US tariffs. So let's vote for a better future. Let's demand and vote on strong policies that protect our health by protecting our environment. And this is our chance to make it happen together. Go out and tell your friends. We've got 2 weeks left to make this happen. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Millie. That was a great segue into our last speaker before the Q&A, Brent Preston.
Thanks, Susan. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Great. So I'm coming to you from my farm. My wife and I farm near Creemore, Ontario. And I'm going to talk primarily tonight about climate change and agriculture. That's really my area of expertise, a little bit about food security and farmland protection. But I wanted to start out with just a little primer. Agriculture is unique because it is both an important source of greenhouse gases and is also particularly vulnerable to climate change. So when we talk about agriculture, we really have to focus both on mitigation and adaptation. About 10% of Canada's national emissions come directly from activities on farm, from primary agriculture. And again, agriculture is unique because we have a fairly even distribution of the three main greenhouse gases that we produce. So we produce carbon dioxide on farms. That's primarily coming from burning fossil fuels, diesel in our tractors and equipment, and from our soils, our agricultural soils. So the carbon, the organic matter that's stored in our soils through different farming practices can be released into the atmosphere, and that's a source of CO2. We also produce nitrous oxide, as we all know, a much more powerful greenhouse gas, and that primarily comes from nitrogen fertilizer. So when we talk about mitigating emissions from agriculture, nitrogen fertilizer is absolutely key. It is the fastest growing source of emissions in Canadian agriculture. Nitrogen fertilizer use is growing exponentially across Canada. And it's also a major expense for farmers. So it offers an opportunity there as well for reduction. And then agriculture also produces a lot of methane. And that's primarily, methane comes from a bunch of different sources on farmland, but it's primarily coming from ruminant animals, grazing animals, and mostly from cattle. So cattle produce a lot of methane. So we have a distributed emissions coming from many farms all across Ontario and across the country. We have lots of different sources on the farm. Those sources are really hard to measure accurately at the farm level. And they so we have and then we also have that vulnerability to climate change, the fact that as people who rely on the weather, we're extremely vulnerable to that sort of to the effects of climate change. So the good news is that we have practices that are widely known, and it was I think it was Luis who said at the beginning, or no, it was the recording at the beginning from David Suzuki. The solutions are known. We have the solutions. We know the practices that we can implement on our farms that reduce our emissions, that sequester carbon in our soils, and make us more resilient to in the face of climate change. And that's something I should have mentioned that's also unique about agriculture is we are one of the few sectors that has the ability to sequester carbon, to draw carbon out of the atmosphere and store it in our soils in large quantities. So while we're spending billions of dollars investing in startups that are looking at direct air capture to solve the climate crisis, in agriculture, we have very, very efficient, low-cost direct air capture technologies for capturing atmospheric carbon, and those are called plants. We do it every day on our farm. So when we talk about the practices that can increase resilience, decrease emissions, sequester carbon, there are lots of them on the farm, but I'll give one example, which is the use of cover crops. So we grow cover crops on our farm. These are crops that we grow not to harvest, but to feed soil microbes, capture carbon, improve soil quality. So we grow, when we finish harvesting our main crops, we plant things like winter rye. We plant legumes that fix atmospheric nitrogen and add them to the soil. And those cover crops increase soil organic matter, which helps make, first of all, draws carbon out of the atmosphere. It also makes us much more resilient in climate change because the more organic matter we have in the soil, the higher the water holding capacity of that soil. So we can absorb water in extreme rainfall events, which we're seeing more frequently. And we can also retain water through drought periods, which we're also seeing more frequently with climate change. So on the policy side, I guess this is a theme that agriculture is unique because it's a shared jurisdiction between the federal government and provincial governments. So when we're looking at climate policy in Ontario, it's not just the Ontario government that's driving things, it's also the federal government. By far the biggest sort of agricultural policy instrument in the country is what's called the Canadian Agricultural Partnership. It is renegotiated every 5 years between the feds and the province. The current partnership, which is called the Sustainable Canadian Agricultural Partnership, goes until 2028, and it's about $3.5 billion of funding over 5 years. So not a lot of money when we compare to the numbers that we're hearing in the energy sector, for example. The biggest segment of that policy or that funding envelope goes to business risk management programs, which are things like crop insurance for farmers. And I'll just wrap up by saying that I think this is an example of where we're really, really vulnerable. The subsidized crop insurance that farmers use is absolutely vital to the functioning of our agricultural system, and it's increasingly under strain and under threat. I don't have stats for Ontario, but last year in Alberta, they paid out $1.6 billion in excess crop insurance payments due to severe weather there. So the climate change threatens our ability to grow food. It also threatens the financial stability of our agricultural system.
Thank you so much, Brent. And thank you to each of the presenters tonight. You've given us a lot of information and a lot to think about. And as such, everyone in this room may have a few questions, which brings us to the next portion of the town hall, the questions and answers. And I hope you've been able to put your questions in the Q&A. I can see some popping up in there now. Joining us I will be inviting back our panelists and inviting Mike Marcolongo and Doris Grinspan to join us as the Q&A section. Mike is an associate program director with Environmental Defence Canada. Before joining ED, Mike worked for several environmental organizations and the government, including the Ontario Environment Network in the province of Ontario. Mike has extensive experience starting organizations and campaigns, including most recently a grassroots campaign called Keep the Greenbelt Promise with the Guelph-based Water Watchers. Welcome, Mike. We also will be joined by Dr. Doris Grinspan, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Registered Nurses Association of Ontario, or the RNAO, the professional association representing registered nurses, nurse practitioners, and nursing students in the province of Ontario. RNAO's mandate is to advance healthy public policy and the role of registered nurses and nurse practitioners. Dr. Grinspan is the founder and visionary of RNAO's internationally renowned Best Practice Guidelines program and a leading figure in Canadian and international health and nursing policy. Welcome, Mike and Doris. So now I'm going to take a look at some of these questions. And the first one is actually going to be for you, Doris. I think it's kind of an interesting one. So why do you as a nurse care about the environment and climate? Typically, nurses care a lot about their jobs, health care. Yet I see the RNAO has a lot of materials on other issues, and I would love to hear why you think to lead on the environment is so important.
So, if you cannot breathe, you cannot live, to put it very simply. We heard fantastic speakers from different perspectives on the environmental and on the climate crisis that we have. I don't know what it will take. We have fire coming to our living rooms, more or less, and to everywhere. Social determinants of health and environmental determinants of health are basically what keeps you healthy. And nurses are all about first keeping people healthy, and then, as Tommy Douglas would say, patch them up when they need to be, healed. The situation is dramatic. I do, however, have questions for the panelists because I tried to find Bonnie Crombie environmental platform. I did find from Mike Schreiner and from the NDP and etc. So I think that it's not as simple as vote anything but is vote smart for really keeping people healthy. And that is social determinants of health, environmental determinants of health, climate crisis, and then the health system that we have. The last comment I want to make has to do with the promise of every Ontarian will have a doctor. Even if we want it, I need to answer to million I have before. We don't have enough doctors, nor will we have, especially not family doctors. So look at Jane Philpott. She has said, and also the federal government, Hollander has said, is either a family doctor or a nurse practitioner that needs to be the attachment for people. And if not, we ain't going to have primary care, which is the cornerstone, absolutely, of a high-functioning system. So nurse practitioner, family doctor, but first comes also how do we keep people healthy with social and environmental determinants of health. Thank you. And that's nursing, by the way. This is the public may have a different perception, but that is nursing. Going back to Florence Nightingale was about keeping people healthy first.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And you actually touched on something of the next question. I'm going to give it to Mike, and it is about kind of the voting smart comment that you were talking about. And David Smith has asked a question about, or the statement saying, my observation from the party roundup is that the three opposition parties are mostly aligned and could split the vote, handing the PCs a majority. Any thoughts on strategic voting?
Sure, I'll take this question happily. There is a group called Cooperate for Canada, and some folks on this call are actually with Cooperate for Canada, and they have started local chapters. I encourage you to check them out. Basically, they're looking at the candidates in terms of the progressive nature of their policies, but also in terms of their ability to pull the vote and beat the incumbent. So there is what they're calling unity candidates, and so they're basically advocating that folks vote Liberal, NDP, or Green, depending um, on the riding. So I encourage you to check that out. I'm also going to just include in the chat here the Environmental Defense. We're working with other NGOs on the kind of green prosperity agenda. So these are questionnaires that have gone to all the parties, and including the Liberals, Greens, NDP, and the Conservatives. Thus far, we've only received 2 questionnaires back from the Liberal Party and the Green Party, but it'll go into depth in terms of some of the environmental issues that we've been talking about tonight.
Okay. Thank you so much. And I've got a question that seems popular for Mark from Ms. Ann Curie. Mark Winfield, what are your thoughts on how municipal governments could get more involved in supporting local renewable energy projects and pushing back on the nuclear and gas industry plan? And Mark, before you get called up, I wanted to note that there's other comments that you might be able to answer at the same time about geothermal projects in the province and if they exist. And Mike, I noticed you've got your hand up, so maybe you'd like to add on to that at the end. Great. Okay.
Well, this one is slightly complicated because the previous government, the Liberal government, had in fact been encouraging the integration of climate considerations into municipal planning. And there were quite explicit references in something called the Provincial Policy Statement, which is sort of the planning Bible in Ontario. All of that disappeared when Mr. Ford rewrote the PPS. Now that doesn't mean, though, that municipalities are continuing to work in the area of community energy and emissions planning. There's quite interesting work that's gone on. It's like Oakville, Brampton North, a number of other places where on their own municipalities have been working on emission reductions within their purview, principally around buildings and green building standards, transportation, those sorts of things. There are limitations on what municipalities can do, especially around building energy efficiency, because that falls mostly to the provincial building code. And there's actually a litigation going on now about the Toronto Green Building Standard. The local hydro utilities, as they're known as local distribution companies in the electricity world, the Toronto Hydros and the Electras, are also quite interested in distributed energy resource development. Indeed, Electra has done a number of pilot projects, but they are constrained by provincial policy in terms of how far they can go. The regime at the moment is mostly designed to protect those incumbents, because if municipalities start to get too successful in developing distributed resources and reducing demand, that starts to reduce grid demand, which makes the large operators like Ontario Power Generation and Bruce Power unhappy, because then their demand goes down and their ability to pay for those big centralized assets starts to become a problem. It becomes what's termed asset stranding in the electricity business. On geothermal, we don't benefit for large-scale electricity generation, geothermal. We don't benefit from any accidents of geology like Iceland does, unfortunately. So resource in that sense is limited. What we can do is ground source heat pumps, where if you have sufficient space and capability, because the ground tends to stay at a fairly constant temperature throughout the year, so you can circulate usually water through a pipe system and effectively take advantage of it for heating purposes in the winter and for cooling purposes in the summer. And so that's very feasible. We've seen that more done at an institutional level. You see universities doing this, for example, if they've got large sort of plots of land where you can do geothermal heat pump systems. one that we've been working on, two interesting ones we've had actually at your campuses. We are actually doing sewer heat recovery at the Glendon campus at Bayview and Lawrence. We're basically putting a heat exchanger in the sewer because sewage is warm. It has energy content, and we have also been in a quite significant conversation with the city of Toronto to have a heat exchange and cooling exchange system with the Keel Reservoir, which is on the other side of Keel Street from us, which stays at a nice 60 degrees all year long. So again, can be used to help with heating in the winter and cooling in the summer. So I say not geothermal in the sense of steam geothermal, like a geyser type thing, but lots of variations on the theme using the heat storage capacity either of the ground or of large reservoirs of water, which are held at a constant temperature.
Thanks, Mark. So energy really is a messy business.
Well,
Bad joke, bad joke.
yeah, I know, but sewage goes into the system at a nice warm temperature, and and there are ways actually of recovering that heat and using it for space heating and water heating. You just never direct contact with the sewage.
Right, right. Mike, you had a follow-up statement?
Mute. Can you hear me now? I just wanted to build on what Mark is saying, especially in terms of Mark did a great job of describing the kind of planning policy framework, and the reality is, as we all know, municipalities are creatures of the province, and if the province isn't really demonstrating strong leadership in this space, it's going to be challenging to reduce emissions and look at innovative ways to address our energy challenges. There is one opportunity that's coming up, and it's called long-term two procurement, where municipalities will play a big role in terms of dictating whether or not they will entertain renewable energy projects or any energy projects in their communities. So if you're in a rural setting, a rural community, there's a lot going on right now as the request for proposals will be released likely in March for the first round of up to 4,000 megawatts of upcoming renewable energy. And unfortunately, this new minister has opened up that procurement to natural gas as well. And we're seeing some, as the RFP has evolved, the deck is being stacked, especially on the dispatchable energy for natural gas. Very disturbing trend that's going on. But municipalities have a veto power in more than one way. Developers will be required to have a municipal support resolution for a project to move forward and to be contracted by the IESO, the Independent Electricity Operator. And the municipality will also be approving any project that is on agricultural or farmland. So an agricultural impact assessment will be approved by the municipality as well. A lot of restrictions. We're hearing from a lot of renewable energy developers who are very frustrated with how the rules are changing through the procurement. So the planning goalposts are moving through the procurement. Very challenging, and it looks like they're frustrating them to the point where many are thinking of not even moving forward with the RFP. Very challenging. So I just wanted to flag that for you. In terms of municipalities, there are both formal and informal networks of councillors and mayors that are working together on this. One step that you can take is to try and build a willing host motion at your council table. Unfortunately, Wind Concerns Ontario is very organized. It's a very effective lobby group. And as of last year, they claim that they have 157 municipalities that have basically a unwilling host designation. So if we can counter that with willing host designations, I think that would certainly help distributed energy, renewables and energy in Ontario.
Great. So it's a really important reminder to get involved at all levels of government.
I
Doris?
want to comment, a quick comment on that. Some of us have the history of some of these things. I will never forget when actually the McGuinty government fell because of wind, and not because they didn't want to do wind, but actually a very progressive party didn't want to do wind at the time under Andrea. I think that we need, number one, to push all politicians, all of them. I think that things will get even worse when we have a federal election, and that will push more all the governments. I think we need to push in all fronts, and yes, we need to look strategically, but with that, we cannot forget what happened in the past, because people promise X, 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 X. One is already there, so we know what X, X means or not, but the others, we don't. And hence why we cannot take the hand on the pulse. I will never forget my discussions with Andrea Orbath when actually the McGuinty government that wanted to do lots of wind, right? Now it's a new leader, Marit Stiles. It's a different person, knows a lot about policy, and I think the commitment is very different. Mike Schreiner, we know he's very different. He has costed everything others have not costed. So I think look at the websites that our colleagues mentioned. Look also at 388 for Ontario and for Canada, and be smart. Be smart.
Thank you. I'm just going to move on to the next question, if that's okay, Mike, and then if we have time, we can come back to you. I'm actually going to try and amalgamate a few comments about food and agriculture. It kind of starts off with a question about food waste. Then we're in the policies and program section. We were discussing different programs that the parties are going to bring in terms of nutrition program, food programs for children, and farming innovations. And I'm just wondering if from the food, agriculture, and land use sectors, if there was an area that we should be looking at in terms of affordability and sustainability, and be talking to the candidates about that. So that's kind of a loaded question with lots. So I'm looking at Doris and Brent on this one. So nutrition and the agricultural piece. Sorry, there's a loaded question. We're running out of time. Brent, would you like to take that first?
Sorry, my audio's cutting out a little bit. I didn't hear the whole thing. I apologize.
Oh no, you're going to make me say that all over. I'm going to ask you if there was a question about food waste, but we're also looking at agricultural subsidies, and if there was, from your perspective, something that we as voters should be aware of and going out and talking to the candidates and the parties about.
Sure. I mean, we don't really have agricultural subsidies in Canada in the way most people think about them. Certainly not the way we have that they are in the United States. But there are a few provincial and federal programs to help farmers make the transition to more climate-friendly and sustainable agricultural practices. There are more than there used to be a few years ago, but there's still very, very little. And we're being outspent by our competitor nations in the US and Europe by many multiples. That in the United States, they spend about 10 times as much per acre on environmental programs in agriculture than we do, and it's 70 times as much in the European Union. So it's very hard to compete when increasingly big food companies and the people who buy our products are interested in sustainability, and we have very, very little support relative to our competitors to follow that sustainability path. So I think if people are talking to, voters are talking to their candidates, what are we going to do to help spur that transition in the agricultural system? Because as I said before, we know the practices we need to apply. We know that many of them have a long-term financial benefit for farmers. They actually make us more money in the long term, but in the short term, they're costly to implement and they involve a lot of risk as we're figuring out how to do them. And we need public support to get over that bump, to get to the point where these practices are self-sustaining.
Thank you so much, Brent. And I am so sorry, Doris, but we are actually at time for the evening and we need to move on to the next closing statement. I hope to hear from you all soon. We'll be following you closely on social media. And thank you all for coming tonight and providing such thoughtful responses to the questions. And I'm going to pass it on to Joyce Hall for closing remarks and some actions that we can all take in the next week or so coming up to the election. Thank you again.
Okay, thank you. Yes, it's time to think now after we've heard from all our speakers about all that needs to be done and how much knowledge there is on what can be done, what we can do ourselves, those of us who have shown up at this town hall and are obviously so concerned. Just for starters, the registrants, all of you will be receiving a link to this town hall on our YouTube channel. And we're also going to share the chat because there were quite a few requests for that. We're also sharing with you now a resource document. Lynn Adamson is putting some documents in the chat for us with links and information on a range of topics, including the ones covered tonight. For example, you'll find 4 questions to ask candidates from the Ontario Clean Air Alliance, 4 also from the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, CAPE, an organization that Millie is from, as well as an election toolkit from the Alliance for a Livable Ontario. So you can have a look at that toolkit and then think, how can I use this in my own circles? Also in the chat now is a link to the Trillium Declaration, a citizens manifesto which addresses the tariff threat from the US and is calling for cooperation among citizens and politicians to ensure the well-being of all of us in the face of this threat. Please read through that document and sign it. We are also posting information on an event on February 24th called Music Votes Ontario, which is for mobilizing youth. And finally, we invite you to become a signatory of our organization, the Ontario Climate Emergency Campaign. We were born in the lead up to the last election when it became apparent that climate needed to be addressed across sectors, industries, and regions. We're a nonpartisan environmental democratic movement advancing climate action and policy around our 12-point action plan. So far, our coalition contains 275 groups and many individuals representing approximately 850,000 Ontarians from all sectors and walks of life, and from across Ontario, where all sorts of very encouraging climate action is happening at both county and lower level municipalities. It's just incredible what I read about. For more information on OCEC, please go to our website, which is also being posted in the chat there. You will receive all of these links in a follow-up email, including the document which has the resources. Finally, you can vote and encourage all your contacts to vote and make climate action part of what you talk about. Planetary health underpins all the issues we've discussed tonight. And we tend to see issues in silos. But as we've heard this evening, they are not. The Earth is one body, and everything we do acts on that body, and we are the bodies on top of the body. So now it's time to thank our wonderful speakers for sharing their expertise. Thanks to our partner, the Registered Nurses Association of Ontario, represented tonight by Doris. And most of all, thanks to all of you for attending. Our last government was elected by just 18% of eligible voters in an election that had the lowest turnout in our province's history. There is so little time, and our choices have never been more important. Our next government wins the privilege to spend our resources while shaping our future and the future of our children. Our speakers have brought home the urgent need to shift the way we occupy this earth Though we tend to think and operate in silos, the underlying message really reflects the truth of the metaphor contained in that I mentioned in our land acknowledgement. The message of the one dish, the one spoon, take only what you need and keep the dish clean. What a wonderful metaphor. So please vote and encourage your contacts to vote. Once again, thanks to everyone who participated in and planned this town hall. And you'll be hearing from us with the follow-up information that I've mentioned. Thank you.
Ontario, there is another way forward. One that is informed by science and respects planetary thresholds and boundaries. One that commits to meaningful relationship building with the original stewards of the earth. One that creates many thousands of decent, secure, sustainable jobs. One that redirects fossil fuel subsidies to achieve real energy security. One that recognizes the climate crisis as the greatest health threat and opportunity of this century. One that achieves deep emissions cuts in buildings and homes, lowering energy costs for all. One that recognizes we do not need more highways to connect and move Ontario. One that recognizes Indigenous people and nature as our greatest climate allies. One that protects food security in Ontario and promotes local food systems. One that boosts climate literacy to engage and activate Ontarians for climate action. One that relies on independent expertise to uphold climate justice principles. One that takes bold and urgent steps to secure a shared future. One that ensures a just transition for all workers. One that prepares Ontario communities for climate disruption still to come. One that addresses environmental racism and intergenerational justice. And one that recognizes that our only way forward is together.